in the unforgiving territory of Red Creek. They say the land never forgets a drop of sweat or a drop of blood. And debts. The real kind. The ones written in the soul always have a way of finding their way back home, no matter how deep you bury them under the limestone soil. Silas Vance had been standing in the family cemetery for nearly 2 hours. A solitary, motionless figure carved against the fading, bruised light of a cruel sun. He stayed long after the last of the neighbors had tipped their sweat-stained hats and retreated to the long shadows of their own porches, leaving him alone in a silence that felt heavier than the parched earth itself. The afternoon heat was beginning to settle into a dull, suffocating pewter, and the only sound in the vast, empty thrum of the valley was the rhythmic, hollow thud of his own heart. His father, a man whose character was as hard and unyielding as the granite ridges surrounding them, had finally surrendered. He had returned to the very dust he'd spent a grueling, thankless lifetime, tilling, leaving behind a legacy of stone-faced endurance and a mountain of unanswered questions that now rested squarely on Silas's broad, tired shoulders. He looked at the gate where the black silk of mourning whipped against the wood like a warning, and he realized that the man who had raised him was now just another secret buried in the dirt, leaving Silas to navigate a world that felt increasingly unfamiliar and hostile. The wind didn't offer comfort. It only brought the scent of ozone and the promise of a long, dry season ahead. Silas wasn't a man built for the display of grief or the luxury of tears. The frontier had burned that out of him years ago, leaving only a dry, quiet resilience in its place. He had inherited his father's stoic mask, a face that gave nothing away to the world, and shoulders wide enough to carry the weight of 1,000 disappointments without a single word of complaint. As the grass crumbled into dust between his fingers, he felt the same fragility in his own life. The small crumpled piece of paper he'd discovered in the inner pocket of his father's old wool coat was weighing on him more than the 400 acres of parched, drought-stricken land. The coat still smelled of tobacco, horsehair, and old sweat, a haunting reminder of the man who had occupied it only days before. The handwriting on the note was jagged and desperate, written on the very night his father's pulse finally flickered out. "I owe the Sterling family a life, Silas. It is a debt older than your own memory, a burden I have carried in the dark for far too long. Now they have lost their land, their name, and every shred of hope. Their daughter Clara has no roof to shield her from the storms of this world. Marry her, Silas. Do not let my last fragment of honor die in the dirt alongside me." For Silas, honor wasn't a choice. It was the only currency a man truly owned in a place this wild. He had sent a brief clinical letter to an address he'd never visited, and a week later, the stranger had arrived. Clara Sterling stepped onto the sun-bleached platform with a calculated poise that made Silas catch his breath. She carried a single battered suitcase, her dark brown hair pinned back with a severity that matched the harsh landscape. Her eyes were the color of a winter sky, wary, exhausted, but filled with an iron-willed steadiness. They stood 5 feet apart, two ghosts of the past, striking a grim bargain. "I'm Silas Vance," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "I received your offer," she replied, her voice as cold as a frozen mountain lake. As they walked toward his wagon under the leaden clouds, Silas felt a chill. A storm was coming, and he wondered if his house and his heart were strong enough to withstand the secrets his new wife was bringing inside. Silas Vance was a man who spoke through the rhythmic swing of a hammer and the steady pull of a saw, rather than through the hollow medium of words. For him, the frontier had long ago stripped away the luxury of conversation, replacing it with a bone-deep understanding of labor and the quiet resilience of a man who fought the earth every single day. As he drove the rusted nails into the weathered gray timber of the north fence, each metallic strike echoed across the vast empty valley like a heartbeat. He watched the way the dust kicked up around his boots, thinking about the woman now occupying the room down the hall from his own. The long, agonizing ride back from the station with Clara had been conducted in a silence so thick it felt like a physical wall between them, a barrier built of mutual secrets and a shared silent agreement to ask no questions. He didn't know how to navigate a life with a woman like her, someone who carried an air of forgotten elegance despite her faded clothes. Silas looked at his own hands, the skin stained with grease earth and the permanent soot of 1,000 fires. He felt the jagged ridge of the scar on his thumb, a reminder of a winter long ago, when he'd nearly lost more than just a piece of skin to the cold. He wondered with a growing sense of unease what a woman like Clara, who smelled of faint lavender and expensive train coal, could possibly find to say to a man who only understood the language of exhaustion. He worked until his shoulders ached, hoping that if he labored hard enough, he could drown out the sudden, unsettling vibration of another soul living under his roof. Inside the farmhouse, the air was heavy with the scent of pine soap and the lingering bitterness of old coffee, a stark contrast to the vast, windswept freedom of the plains outside. Clara moved through the small, sparse rooms, like a spirit that hadn't quite decided if it was ready to inhabit this world or simply vanish into the shadows. She stood by the south window, watching the golden slanted light play across the dust motes dancing in the air. The view was beautiful in its desolation, miles of rolling hills that offered no comfort, only the terrifying vastness of a new beginning. She felt the cool weight of the silver band on her finger, a ring that Silas had produced from a small wooden box without a word of sentiment on the evening they arrived. It felt alien to her, a brand of a life she hadn't chosen, but was forced to embrace for the sake of survival. She gently rubbed the metal, her skin pale against the silver, thinking of the life she had left burning behind her in the east. Every time she heard the distant rhythmic thud of Silas's hammer against the fence line, a shiver would run down her spine. It was the sound of her new reality, a reality built on labor obligation and the presence of a man she didn't know. She had begun to learn his habits without realizing it, the way he took his coffee black and scalding hot, the way he scraped his boots twice before entering the kitchen, and the heavy, unhurried cadence of his footsteps on the porch. She was a guest in a house that was technically hers by law, a stranger in a kitchen where she now prepared meals for a husband whose eyes never quite met her own. She wondered if the morning would ever come when she didn't wake up reaching for a past that was gone forever, or if this house would always feel like a beautifully lit cage, where the only thing keeping her safe was the silence of the man working in the fields. Trouble in the West rarely arrived with the roar of thunder. More often it came with the soft, rhythmic thud of a well-bred horse and the scent of expensive tobacco drifting on a dry breeze. The man sitting atop the coal-black stallion was Randall Moore, a practical man with a great deal of money and a long, calculated habit of acquiring things that other people were struggling to hold on to. He didn't look like a villain from a dime novel. He looked like a merchant of inevitability, his suit pristine despite the dust of Red Creek. Moore had been watching the Vance Ranch for years, waiting for the moment Silas's father would finally break, and now seeing Silas alone at the gate, he smelled a vulnerability that he intended to exploit. His smile was a thin, practiced line, a professional courtesy that carried no warmth and even less mercy. He adjusted his hat with a slow, deliberate movement, his pale eyes scanning the property, not for its beauty, but for its weaknesses. He saw the leaning fence posts and the unpainted barn, and he saw a debt that was finally coming due. Silas stood his ground, feeling the familiar heavy tension that always accompanied Moore's presence. It was a pressure that felt more deleterious than a winter storm, because it came wrapped in legal documents and polite concern. Moore represented a world that Silas didn't understand, a world where land was just a number on a ledger and where a man's sweat was worth less than the ink on a contract. As the predator watched from his high saddle, the silence between them grew heavy, filled with the unspoken reality that this visit was not about neighbors. It was about an empire looking to swallow a fragment of a man's soul. When Moore's gaze shifted past Silas, landing on Clara, as she emerged from the porch, the air in the yard seemed to turn cold. It was a predatory look, and that calculated her value and her vulnerability in a single sweeping glance. Silas felt a sudden violent instinct that he hadn't prepared for, a primitive need to shield the woman who, until that moment, he had considered merely a contractual obligation. He stepped into the dust, placing his wide frame directly between the predator on the horse and the woman in the shadows. He gripped the handle of his shovel so tightly that the wood groaned under the pressure, the veins on his weathered forearms standing out like mountain ridges. It wasn't just his land he was defending anymore. It was the sanctity of the promise he'd made to a dead man. The word alone had been the lever Moore intended to use, but Silas realized then that he was no longer standing by himself. This marriage born of debt and desperation had suddenly become a fortress. Clara's presence behind him, silent and wary, gave Silas a reason to push back that went beyond taxes and titles. He could feel her breath in the stillness, a living thing that Moore's money couldn't buy and his threats couldn't break. The ranch might be struggling, and the well might be running dry, but Silas Vance was a man who understood honor better than he understood survival. As he stared up at Moore, the message was clear. Without a single word being spoken, the Vance name was not for sale, and the woman who now bore it was under a protection that no lawyer's ink could dissolve. The conflict was no longer about a past debt. It was about a future Silas hadn't known he wanted until he was forced to fight for it. The storm did not arrive as a visitor. It came as a conqueror, sweeping across the Red Creek Valley with a cold blue fury that even the oldest settlers hadn't seen in a decade. The wind howled through the gaps in the eaves, a mournful, high-pitched scream that made the very bones of the farmhouse groan under the pressure of the mounting drifts. Inside, the world had shrunk to the small amber circle of warmth provided by the hearth. For the first time since Clara's arrival, the vastness of the plains was hidden behind a wall of white, leaving the two of them trapped within the intimate, narrow confines of 4 wooden walls. The firelight was a restless thing, dancing and spitting against the seasoned pine logs, casting long, distorted shadows of Silas and Clara against the rough-hewn timber of the wall. In that flickering orange glow, they looked less like strangers and more like silhouettes from a forgotten myth. 2 lonely figures bound together by a fate they were only just beginning to understand. The silence between them, which had always been a shield, was starting to feel like a burden. The roar of the gale outside only heightened the stillness inside, making every breath, every crackle of the flame, and every shift of a chair feel amplified, as if the house itself was waiting for someone to finally break the seal of their long, agonizing reserve. It was a night for ghosts to speak, and for secrets that had been buried in the frost to finally find the light of the fire. Silas found her sitting at the kitchen table long after the clocks had struck midnight, the only illumination coming from the dying embers in the stove. She was holding a tattered scrap of paper, her fingers trembling so slightly that only a man used to observing the smallest tremors in the earth would have noticed. It was a letter, he realized. Or perhaps a fragment of a life she'd tried to leave behind in the smoke and ash of the East. Her usual armor of calculated indifference had been eroded by the biting cold and the absolute isolation of the storm. For the first time, he didn't see the woman who had walked off the train with iron in her eyes and ice in her voice. He saw a person who was fundamentally heartbreakingly tired of running. Silas didn't offer empty words or hollow comforts that neither of them believed in. He simply pulled out the heavy oak chair and sat down opposite her, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't reach across the table to touch her hand, knowing that such a gesture might cause her to recoil back into the shadows of her own defense. But he offered her something far more rare in this unforgiving world, his undivided mountain-like presence. He sat there, a solid anchor in the middle of her private storm, his silence no longer a wall meant to exclude her, but a bridge meant to support her. He watched the way the firelight caught the moisture in her eyes that were no longer the color of a winter sky, but of a soul that had reached the absolute end of its endurance. When she finally spoke, her voice was a fragile whisper, barely audible over the rattling of the frosted window panes. She spoke of the fear Randall Moore had instilled in her, of the secrets that had chased her across 3 states, and of the crushing weight of being a woman with no name and no home of her own. Silas listened with a depth that transcended pity understanding in his soul, that her scars were not so different from the ones etched into his own calloused hands. The gesture was simple, almost mundane, yet in the context of their cold, practical arrangement, it was nothing short of a revolution. Silas turned his hand over palm up, offering it not as a claim of ownership, but as a place of rest, a sanctuary for her weariness. It was an unspoken invitation to stop fighting the world alone, a promise that his strength was now hers to lean on. For several long, heavy minutes, the only sound in the house was the sharp crackle of the dying fire and the rhythmic, ghostly whistle of the wind through the eaves. Then, with a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to carry the weight of her entire journey, Clara reached out. Her hand was small and deathly cold, her porcelain-pale skin a stark contrast against his weathered, earth-stained palm. But as their skin finally met something fundamental, shifted in the very foundation of the Vance farmhouse, the contract they had signed in the dusty and different office of the town clerk suddenly dissolved, replaced by a covenant that required no ink and no witnesses. In that quiet moment, the morning that the title of their story promised began to take its first true shape, a morning where they were no longer 2 strangers paying a dead man's debt, but 2 partners facing an uncertain dawn together. The snow continued to pile up against the door, sealing them in, Hal. From the rest of the world, but for the first time in his life, Silas felt that the walls were no longer keeping him in. They were keeping the shadows out. They sat there in the fading orange glow, their hands joined in a silent pact of survival. And something deeper, realizing that the greatest storm wasn't the one raging outside, but the one they had finally survived together, inside. When the great winter finally broke its grip on Red Creek, it didn't leave quietly. It melted into a season of soft, persistent rains that turned the bruised purple ridges into a vibrant, defiant green. But the real transformation wasn't happening in the soil of the valley. It was happening within the heavy timber walls of the Vance farmhouse. The morning that the townspeople would later talk about wasn't marked by a grand celebration or a public declaration of love. It happened on a Tuesday in early April, just as the first lavender sprouts began to peek through the frost-thawed earth. It was a morning like any other, yet entirely different. Silas had woken up before the sun, as he always did. But for the first time in 10 years, he didn't feel the crushing weight of solitude pressing against his chest. He stood in the kitchen watching the steam rise from the coffee pot and realized that the silence was no longer an enemy to be endured, but a companion to be shared. When Clara walked into the room, her hair no longer pinned back with that severe defensive precision, he didn't look away. He saw her not as a debt to be paid or a stranger to be protected, but as the very heartbeat of the land he had almost lost. Randall Moore had returned once with his lawyers in tow, but he found a fortress he couldn't breach. Not a fortress of stone, but of two people who had decided that their shared future was worth more than any price. Silas had stood by her, his presence an unyielding shield, and the predator finally saw there was no longer any room to hunt. As they led the horses out under the soft amber glow of the sunset, their shadows joined across the new grass. Silas watched Clara touch the wooden gate, the same gate where the black ribbon had once fluttered, and he knew she was no longer a guest. She was home. They had started with a cold bargain, but they had finished with a truth neither dared to dream of. In the quiet dawn of Red Creek, they were finally free.